Hello everyone, Michael Jones from Michael Jones Custom Knives. Welcome to my forge. In today's video, I'll be doing an overview of my latest project, a custom built feather pattern Damascus fighter. I'll take you through all the steps I followed to create this knife, and hopefully you can learn something about the knife making process along the way. If you like what you see in this video, please come back to my channel and check out future videos. And as always, please subscribe.
The first step is to cut up the steel to create the billet. Here you can see that I'm cutting up some 15N20 and 1084 stock, and I'm grinding off any mill scale and getting it ready to stack into billets. Here I'm cleaning the pieces of steel with acetone to get off any grease, fingerprints, or oil that may be on them before I stack them into a billet. I have two billets stacked up here. The Damascus will have two types of patterns within the steel itself. There will be a straight pattern with no curves or waves in it made from the straight billet, and then the W billet will be forged with crushed W's to form a standard feather pattern billet. Later in the process, these two billets will be combined into a single billet with an alternating pattern, which I will use to make the knife from. Here I'm adding borax flux to the billet to keep it from oxidizing while it's in the forge. The flux melts and gets into the seams and helps prevent oxygen from getting in between the different layers of steel. I'm setting the initial forge weld on the billet. I like to go in from the side of my press and use the length of the dies, and then I'll turn it around and come in from the other direction. I'm going very slowly and just taking light presses at this point, setting the initial welds. At this point, I'm starting to make the crushed W's on this billet, part of the normal feather making pattern process. I'll crush in the corners, then flatten it back out in the opposite direction and draw it out into a long bar. I used this antique vise I got from my grandfather to straighten my billets. I added some straight pieces to the jaws, some angle iron, 1/2 inch thick, and I've put the hot billets in there and used the jaws of the vise to straighten my billets out. It's much easier than taking them to an anvil and hammering them out, and you don't get hammer dents in your billet that way. Now that I've finished forging out the W billet, it's time to start on the straight billet. I'll be basically following the same process, except for this billet I won't be making any crushed W's. It'll just be drawn out into a long flat bar. Here's the first billet, the W billet, after I forged it out and it's cooled down. Here I'm getting ready to measure it out and mark it and cut it into pieces, and then put it on my belt grinder and grind all the surfaces flat to get ready for the restack and the next forge welding. Here's the W billet after it's been cut up and surface ground and numbered to keep it in order. Next, you'll see me starting to cut up the single layer billet, and I'll repeat the same process. I'll cut it up into pieces and surface grind it flat on both sides, getting it ready for the restack. In this step, I'm starting to assemble the combined billet, which is made from the straight layer billet and the W billet. I'm heating the billet, getting it ready to forge it out. This is the W billet and straight billet stacked together to make my alternating pattern. This will get forged out into a bar, then cut up and restacked into a vertically stacked billet. I will then forge that billet together and then center cut the stacked billet down the middle. This will create the two halves of the feather pattern billet. Now I want to remind you that I've already reforged the W billet and the straight billet 2 additional times that I did not show on camera. This will be the 3rd time these 2 billets will be forged out, but now they are combined together to make the final billet that I will make the knife from. I forged the billet out and cut the ends off with my bandsaw. Now I have the billet in my mill, and I will mill the side edges down to a flat surface. Then I'll take the billet to my surface grinder attachment on my 2x72 belt sander and surface grind the top and bottom sides flat. Then I will cut the billet up into equal size pieces to create the vertical stack for the feather billet. I finished surface grinding and cutting up the bar. Now I have the vertical stack set up and I'm about to weld it to get it ready to go into the forge. I wound up with 7 pieces, approximately 1.5 inches wide by 2 inches long and about 1 inch thick. This will make the new vertical billet that I will be cutting down the center in the next step. welded on the handle to the billet, and when I brought it over to the smaller forge, I found that it was a little too tall to fit, so I wound up laying it on its side and turning it at an angle, and it eventually went in and fit the forge. For a few minutes, I thought I might have to light my larger forge on the left, but luckily I was able to make this billet fit. It only has to fit in this first time until I get it over to the press and compress it down, and then for the reheats, it should go in without any problem. Here's the most difficult part of all the forging. I've got the stack in the press, and I'm taking my time setting the forge welds on the stack. I don't want to press too hard, or you'll bend the stack over and you'll get a large curve or wave in it, and it'll be very difficult to straighten. After I've forged it down to about 5 inches tall, I switch out the dies and put in my cutter die and get the billet up to temperature and bring it back over to the press. And then I take my time splitting down through the billet through the center. If you don't take your time and you're not careful, you can actually rip the seams apart on the edges. If you notice, I had to put a plate underneath it at one point because the cut started to drift to one side. So to get it lined back up, I had to tilt the billet on its side a little bit to continue cutting down through the middle. Now that the billet is cut in two, I ground the cut surfaces flat so the two pieces would fit up together nicely. Then I took my welder and I welded all the seams closed and welded a handle on it, getting it ready for the next step, which is where you will forge the two pieces back together and draw it out, and that's where you start to actually form the feather pattern. After a few cycles through the forge, I managed to draw the billet out into a long bar. It's now the two halves forged together. And I have enough steel in this billet that I can actually make two knives. So I wound up cutting this billet in half. I'll save the one half for another project at a later date. And I'll take the other half and work on the knife that I'm making for this project. The billet is all forged out, it's surface ground, it's flat, and here I'm doing a test etch to see how the pattern has turned out. This will be the last step before I start doing stop removal to actually form the knife out of this. I won't be forging this on an anvil and shaping the knife because it'll distort the pattern. Instead, I will put a pattern on the side of this billet and then I'll do stop removal to get the shape of the knife once I see how the pattern turns out. After doing a test etch, I drew the profile of the knife on with a marker onto the billet, and now I'll start to do stop removal with my belt grinder and profile the knife. It's time to grind in the bevels. I start with the spine of the knife and grind in those bevels first. Then I use marking die and scribe a line down the center of the blade on the knife edge. Then I flip the knife over and I move to the blade and grind in the ricasso and the bevel. Once the bevels are ground in, I start hand sanding the blade. I do this before the heat treatment because it's a lot easier to sand out grinding marks to a smooth finish on a blade that has not yet been heat treated. It's a lot easier to do this on an annealed blade rather than after hardening the blade. I've never had any issues doing it this way, and it saves a lot of elbow grease and wear and tear on my body. Now that the blade has been sanded and polished, it's time to start working on the guard. I'm making my guard out of a piece of 1084 steel, so I cut a piece of stock off and I mark it to get it ready to put it on my mill so I can mill out the slot for the tang of the knife to fit through. I had a piece of the straight layer billet left over, so I decided to use that to make a spacer to go between the guard and the handle. So I milled out a slot so the tang would fit through it. I also added 2 pieces of stainless steel 1/8 inch thick on either side to create the spacers. Now that I've got the guard and the spacers fitted to the tang, it's time to start working on the stag horn handle. Here I'm using my old drill press just to drill out the center of the handle so I can start fitting it to the tang. Here I'm using my wheel attachment on my belt grinder to round off the edges of the tang. Once I do that, I'll wrap the tang in Teflon tape. Then once I wrap it in tape, I'll put JB Weld on it, and I'll put a lot on there so it fills the spaces inside of the handle. Then I take the stag handle and slide it down over the tang, making sure that I get a good tight fit against the spacers. Then I press it down and squeeze the extra out, and we'll clean it off. I do this so I can pull the stag handle off and on multiple times as I fit it up and do all the final fit and finish on the handle. While I'm waiting for the JB Weld epoxy to dry inside the handle, I'll put the first of many coats of potassium permanganate on the handle to start darkening it. It's a natural way to darken the stag handle. After wet setting the handle and the epoxy's had time to dry, I pull the handle off. Then I put the spacers back on and I super glue them together, getting them ready so that I can drill holes to set pins. Next, I'll slip the stag handle back down over the tang and snug it up against the stainless steel spacer. Then I draw the profile or the outline of the stag handle onto the stainless steel spacer. And what this does is it gives me the exact outside dimensions of where the stag handle is in relation to the tang, and that gives me the clearance of where I can drill my holes to put in the pins. Once I've drawn the outside profile of the stag handle onto the spacer, I'll pull the handle off, and then I'll slip the guard and the spacers off of the tang while they're still super glued together. And just to be safe, I'll add a small bolt and a nut through the slot that I milled through the center and tighten it down just so nothing moves. Then I'll chuck it up in my mill and I'll drill a 3/32 hole on either side of the tang within the outside edges of the handle. That way I know that everything will fit perfectly back together once I slip things apart and I start to work on the handle. The handle and the guard and the spacers will come off multiple times during the process of fitting everything up and making sure everything is flush and tight. The Stag handle wound up being just a little bit long, so I wound up cutting about 1 inch off. I like my handles to be around 5 to 5.5 inches long. Next, I started working on fitting the bolt onto the tang, getting ready to weld it on so then I can start working on the pommel. I'm working on the pommel. I made it out of another piece of 1084 steel. I chuck it up in my mill and mill in a hole so that I can put in a 1/4 inch coupling so that can be threaded onto the 1/4 inch bolt that I welded onto the tang. Now that I finished making the pommel and fitting it to the tang and to the handle, I'll put the Stag handle back on to the spacers and I'll draw the outline of the handle again. I'll use this as the grinding lines to start grinding down the spacers to their final shape. Now it's time to start grinding the final shape of the guard and getting it aligned with the spacers. All of the knife parts are finished. They've all been fitted, sanded, polished, and ready for heat treatment, which is the next step. After quenching the knife and the parts in Parks 50 quenching oil, it's time to temper the blade. I'll take the knife and the parts and put them in the oven for 2 1-hour cycles at 420 degrees Fahrenheit. This will take the brittleness out of the steel. Once they're tempered, I'll pull them back out and let them cool, and then I will take them back to the bench and sand them to remove any marks that I might have missed in the earlier process. Then on to the buffing wheel to get everything back to a mirror polish. This gets everything ready for the etching process and then final assembly. For the guard and the pommel, since they're both made out of 1084 steel, I decided to cold blue these parts black. I thought that would contrast well with the feather pattern in the Damascus and also the stainless steel fittings in the handle. I'm cleaning the guard, getting all the fingerprints and oil off, and getting ready to apply the cold blue. Before I etch the blade in ferric chloride, I need to apply my maker's mark. So here I'm setting up to do an electrical etch and apply my maker's mark to the left-hand side of the blade. I use brass black to darken my maker's mark. It does a good job darkening the image, and it buffs off easily off of the steels, and it really makes the maker's mark pop. I didn't film it, but I wound up sanding the knife and the parts again up to 3000 grit sandpaper and then rebuffed them. After I put my maker's mark, I noticed there was a few little tiny scratches that were still showing through that I had missed, so I went back and redid that. You want to make sure you have a mirror polish before you etch the knife in ferric chloride. That way you don't have any imperfections in your etching and your pattern will shine through. Now that I'm ready to etch, I'll wash everything in acetone, then bring it inside and wash it with hot water and soap and scrub everything down really thoroughly. This removes any grease, oil, or fingerprints. If you leave anything on the blade like that, it'll cause imperfections in your etch and it'll show up as blotches on the steel. After etching for about 6 minutes in the ferric chloride, I pull the spacer and the knife blade out and wash them again with soap and water under warm water in the sink. Then I prepare a hot batch of instant coffee. I boil water, add instant coffee, and then add the blade and the spacer to that and let them coffee etch for several hours. This helps to darken the etch and make it more permanent and set it in. Now it's time for the final assembly of the knife. Applying epoxy to all the handle components, the guard, the spacers, the Stag handle, putting on the pommel and tightening it up, and then cleaning all the excess epoxy off, and then doing the final bluing onto the pommel. After several days and many hours of work, the knife is finally finished. Here it is. I hope you like what you see. That concludes today's video. I hope you enjoyed this build of this feather pattern Damascus fighter. And again, if you like what you saw in the video, please come back and check my channel out for future videos. And please don't forget to subscribe.